Today we're going to take a look at both Virginia and Massachusetts and kind of put the two side by side and compare. So we're going to look at several different topics. First off, let's talk about who lived there. Starting with Virginia, in 1607, Jamestown Colony, we know that Virginia was settled by young, single men. Whereas Massachusetts was from early on settled by families. So taking a look at those passenger lists really showed that. What we saw coming to Virginia, there were some women, but not very many. And there weren't very many married couples or young children. But going to Massachusetts, there were a lot of women, a lot of married couples, and a lot of kids. Most of the folks heading to Virginia were Anglicans, right? They were members of the Church of England. Whereas in Massachusetts, most of the people going up to Massachusetts were Puritans. They were part of that group that wanted to break away from the Anglican Church and purify it. In Virginia, we know that the driving motivation was wealth and opportunity. People came to Virginia looking first for gold, and when they didn't find gold, they looked for wealth through other means, most importantly, tobacco. But in Massachusetts, we saw people who were looking for a place where they could practice their religion freely. So from the Pilgrims in 1620 to the Puritans, the larger groups that started coming over in 1630, the big driving force was wanting to practice their religion freely. Next, let's talk about the economy of the two colonies. And just by looking at this picture, gives you a good sense. Virginia, growing crops, growing tobacco, Massachusetts, other industries, trade, full of seaports, so there's going to be some important differences here. In Virginia, they mostly grew tobacco, while in Massachusetts, they make money and make a living through other means. They did grow some food. There are some things that will grow there, but the climate's not quite as good for growing lots of things up there. So they also fished. They sold timber. Right? Tons of trees, lots and lots of timber up there. So there's some other means of making money. In Virginia, we know that early on, they relied heavily on indentured servants, later enslaved Africans. Whereas in Massachusetts, work was usually done by the members of the family. In Virginia, there were very large farms. In Massachusetts, there are farms, but they're typically very small compared to the farms in Virginia. Because remember, in Virginia, we had the headright system. So that encouraged people to bring lots of people over and get big plantations, big, large farms. Farms in Massachusetts tended to be much smaller. Next, let's talk about government. And again, some similarities, some differences. So how are they governed? Some similarities here. Both colonies were at first governed by a company that had a charter from the king, and then later by a royal governor. So the king came back and said, all right, you know what? I'm going to send over somebody to be in charge. One of the most important accomplishments from the Virginia colony was setting up the House of Burgesses. That was the first representative assembly in the New World. And what we saw from Massachusetts was the Mayflower Compact, another very important document, important accomplishment, where the settlers on the Mayflower wrote down a plan and said they agreed to make laws together and then follow those laws. In Virginia, the burgesses, the representatives in the House of Burgesses, were elected by white male landowners. And what we saw in Massachusetts was self-governing towns who were run by church members. And, those church members were white male church members, so some similarities there. Let's talk about the communities themselves. And again, if you see the picture, Virginia, big plantation houses, big large farms. Massachusetts, things are more based in towns and small communities. In Virginia, people live spread out. In Massachusetts, people tended to live closer together, right? In Virginia, there were very few farms. The farms that were there were very large because of the headright system, so people were pretty spread out. The towns in Massachusetts had to have a church and often a school. We talked about that, how if it got big enough, the town was supposed to provide a church and a school. In Virginia, every farm kind of did its own thing. Every farm was what's called self-sufficient. The farmer would make sure that he had enough help, either from servants or from enslaved Africans, to run the farm. And what we saw in Massachusetts was more of the idea of civic virtue, everybody pitching in to help out. Whether that was repairing roads or building fences or serving in the militia, everybody had to step up and help out. Last area we're going to look at is health and lifestyle. In Virginia and in Massachusetts, more than half the people died in the first year. So starting out a colony was a very difficult endeavor for many reasons. Dealing with the environment, facing attacks from natives, diseases, starvation. We've talked about lots of obstacles that both colonies had to overcome. But we've also talked about how once you kind of get over that hump and get past some of those initial obstacles, both the colonies start to grow. By the mid-1600s, the average life expectancy in Virginia was 40, which, back then people didn't, the life expectancy was lower than it is today. In comparison, the average life expectancy in the same time frame in Massachusetts was 60. So, for different reasons, people were living longer up in Massachusetts than they were in Virginia. You have a connection question in your notes. Thinking about everything you've learned so far from class about the Virginia colony and the Massachusetts colony, if you were going to come to America in this time period, would you have wanted to come to Virginia, or would you have wanted to come to Massachusetts? Either way you answer is fine, but you need to think of 3 good reasons to support your decision and write those down and include them in your notes.